Okay, let's just pick up right where we left off last week. We had a bit of a battle royale and a focused discussion on the question of Gertrude's agency. Is she in on the plot? Is she just another one of Claudius's pawns? Does she love Claudius? Is she power-hungry, scheming, conniving, murderous? Or is she docile, stupid, just waiting to be told what to do and looking for anyone to submit to? You should know we don't actually have to choose one way or the other. Like I said last week, we don't really have a lot of evidence on Gertrude, especially regarding her own motivations. She's more of a blank space left in the text. On the other hand, Emily and Adam both pointed out some really strong points of textual evidence that could infer one way or the other. What this really leaves us with then is an ambiguity in the text. Ambiguity makes us uncomfortable. We want to be told one way or the other. We want to be right. We want to have evidence to support our positions. But honestly, sometimes that's a trap. The text may be silent, ambiguous, or even ambivalent on purpose. It could have intentionally removed all traces from the text. It could have intentionally offered conflicting points of data. It could even intentionally offer direct evidence in support of two contradictory ideas. When the text gives us this kind of uncertainty, we don't need to buckle down on one side or the other. We should instead ask, why would the text be ambivalent on this specific point? When we're dealing with the text about epistemic uncertainty and our inability to know or trust the truth, embracing ambiguity is essential. Rather than resolving the ambivalence, push. That's the place the text will reveal more of its meaning. So what's the text ambiguous about? I want to focus on two major things: the agency of women in the text and the role of the ghost in giving Hamlet evidence that his father was murdered by Claudius. Really, when I think about it, that's really one thing, the motivation of characters. For the female characters, the motivations are either usurped by the men that surround them or are left silent by the text. For Hamlet, his motivation stems from some impossible experience, one that he could have imagined or even been deceived by. With Hamlet, we see the uncertainty represented directly on the stage. With someone like Ophelia, we have the uncertainty thrust upon us as the audience. Let's start there. Let's start with Ophelia. My sources for this section come from two main places. The first is a Shakespeare scholar named Elaine Showalter. Her article is called Representing Ophelia. It's fairly short. I've included it in the additional resources section for this play. The second source is the French psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan. That name may be familiar to you folks from the novel class last year. I'll put a link to the written lecture from that class if it helps anyone. Lacan gave a really famous lecture on Ophelia called Desire and the Interpretation of Desire in Hamlet. He starts with this line: "I announced that I would speak today on that piece of bait named Ophelia." Yuck. Piece of bait? Unfortunately, that's exactly what Lacan and so many other critics have used Ophelia as. In the history of criticism, Ophelia has often been a cipher or an excuse to talk about the other male characters of the text. Lacan himself later says in that same lecture, "What is the point of the character Ophelia? Ophelia is obviously essential. She is linked forever, for centuries, to the figure of Hamlet. So Ophelia is essential because she's linked to Hamlet." To Showalter, this bait and switch is only one way the character is reappropriated toward the particular ends of a literary scholar with axes to grind, something that even most feminist scholarship on Ophelia does as well. But ultimately, these approaches only end up further erasing Ophelia herself. Showalter writes, "To liberate Ophelia from the text, or to make her its tragic center, is to reappropriate her for our own ends. To dissolve her into a female symbolism of absence is to endorse our own marginality. To make her Hamlet's anima is to reduce her to a metaphor of male experience." Now, in all truth, Ophelia is hardly in this play at all. She only has like 58 lines. And of those lines, 13 are when she's gone mad and singing. Yet, for some reason, Ophelia has held a much larger portion of the popular imagination. It's kind of like dream distortion. Her presence in the play expands so that the popular perception is that she's a major element of the story. She's not, but we're obsessed with her. Showalter uses this as an opportunity to apply a feminist reading, not just of Ophelia in the text, but of Ophelia as she's been represented on the stage over centuries, particularly how those representations map on to larger cultural ideas about women in each period. She says, "I would like to propose instead that Ophelia does have a story of her own that feminist critics can tell, the history of her representation. When Shakespeare's heroines began to be played by women instead of boys, the presence of the female body and female voice, quite apart from the details of interpretation, created new meanings and subversive tensions in these roles, and perhaps most importantly with Ophelia. Looking at Ophelia's history on and off stage, I will point out the contest between male and female representations of Ophelia, cycles of critical repression and feminist reclamation, of which contemporary feminist critics is only the most recent phase. Feminist readings of Ophelia are, for Showalter, the most recent way culture uses Ophelia as a mirror of femininity, as the receptacle of feminine symbolism, or the paragon of female performance. All this to say, Ophelia is important in the text, in spite of her small presence there. And more than that, Ophelia is important to the viewers and readers of the text. Now, to be fair to Lacan in all of this, his framework is certainly one way to get a hold of why Ophelia has become such a powerful image for us. One of Lacan's main contributions to the literary theory is making Freudian psychoanalysis a bit more palatable. Freud, you all know this stuff, so a little review. Freud theorized that the self, or the I, or the ego, emerged as a mechanism to navigate between two fundamental forces at war in us: the gratifying, sustaining, protecting desires of the unconscious libido and the normalizing, socializing, rule-based demands of the superego. On the one hand, the id drives my desires and motivates my physical needs. The old joke, right? The 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, reproducing. But the superego, on the other hand, establishes the social norms required for people to live in harmony. The ego, the thing I call I, or the self, is the conscious part of my mind that seeks to fulfill libidinal desires in a way that appeases the superego. So, Freud sees all of this happening first in the family structure. The father represents the superego, authority, control, sovereignty, rule, law. The child wants that for themselves. The id desires to be on top of the totem pole, so to speak, and so wants to supplant the father. The first image or sign of the father's domination is his sexual domination over the mother. Therefore, for the child learning to navigate between the id and the superego, the first step becomes sexually desiring the mother. The Oedipal complex, you guys know this stuff. Eventually, the child will transfer this desire toward another socially acceptable symbol of control, a different woman. Hamlet loves Ophelia, right? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe that love for Ophelia is merely a substitute for desire for his own mother, which is really a desire for the authority once held by his father, now held by his rival Uncle Claudius. Hamlet's madness on this reading would be a result of Claudius inserting himself between Hamlet and his hopes for advancing towards self-mastery. Now, you can easily see how weird all this is. We have to invent all sorts of new motivations for the characters. It's also pretty sexist. Women are reduced to mere symbols of male authority. Really, in the end, the best we can hope for is the continuation of the systems of war and domination that got us into this mess in the first place. Hamlet's argument would have to go something like this: it's wrong to murder the king to become king, so I'll murder the king to become king. That would just make Hamlet into Claudius. Hamdius. Claude. Wait a second, we're talking about Ophelia. Bait and switch, sorry. Here's where Lacan might help us. Rather than thinking of the mother as the mere symbol of the father's sexual conquest, Lacan reads the mother herself as an essential part of the development of the ego. For Lacan, the development of the I, or ego, comes through 3 stages: the imaginary stage, the mirror stage, and the real. So first, the imaginary stage. This is the pre-linguistic stage of a newborn child. Here, there is not yet any distinction between the child and the mother. A newborn, doctors tell me, newborns' eyes can only focus on an object 18 inches away from their face. So think about it. A mother nursing a baby. The only thing the baby can see clearly is the mother's face. In this stage of development, there is for the child no way of knowing where the mother ends and the child begins. They have no concept of I and you. The whole universe of experience is characterized by a fundamental oneness. Really so much so that a term like oneness wouldn't even make sense. This is a time of peace and harmony between all things. The next stage of development, though, the child comes to determine the difference between self and other. Lacan calls this the mirror stage, because here the child begins to define their own body through the symbol represented to them in the mirror. They see themselves as an object distinct from other objects. Now, this may be shocking to you, but that person you see in the mirror is not you. It is a reflection of you. Yet when you see it, somehow you know that it represents you apart from other people. In this stage of development, the child can begin to see themselves as something distinct from the mother, because they learn to mediate their experience through symbols, And the first is the symbol of their own image in the mirror. That thing in the mirror is me. That thing over there is mom. This opens the door to a whole host of other symbols, most notably language, words, the sounds by which we refer to objects in the world. Here, the child learns to distinguish all things as individual, specific things. She names them. Now, this is a good thing in general because it gives us a new way to take control over the world. The goal of life development, the social order, the superego, is to become a master of symbols. But it's also pretty obvious here what's lost is that immediate, intimate oneness enjoyed with the mother in the imaginary stage. The mirror stage for Lacan is represented by the father, the symbol of social control, patriarchy. This is why Lacan has become very helpful for feminist scholars. This really all boils down to how a person can resist the patriarchy. Compare it to Freud. The desire the child has for the mother is not some gross, misplaced sexual desire that stands in for his desire to become the father. Rather, desire for the mother is a desire to return to that initial stage of peace, oneness, unity, harmony, all that stuff the imaginary stage represented. But I can't merely return to the imaginary stage. I can't return to the imaginary because I is a function of the mirror. I can't go back. The genie is out of the bottle. But I can go forward. There's one stage yet beyond the symbolic, a stage in which we can regain the lost paradise of the imaginary without sacrificing the meaningful and meaning-making power of the symbolic. This, Lacan calls the real. The real for Lacan comes when a person has a deeply intimate experience with another or the world around them, in which the distinctions imposed by the self slip away and the fundamental unity of the world is free to re-emerge. In this reconnection, the self is not abandoned. It is still I who enjoys the moment, but the I is now transcended into a larger experience of the whole that I am a part of. But if I ever do experience again the deep unifying oneness that I desire in the imaginary stage, how could I ever know it but through language? There does seem to need to be a return to the symbolic order of the patriarchal mirror stage regardless. Okay, here's where Ophelia comes in. She goes mad, like proper mad, not like Hamlet faking mad. And how does she do it? Singing. Look, if patriarchy is represented by mastery over language, if the real beckons on the other side of the mirror with the promise of both the self and the whole reunited, then the only way anyone can talk about it is in language that is undoing itself. Irrational language that doesn't give me distinct separate ideas. Mad language that comes in songs about imaginary things, songs about relationships, people and flowers used interchangeably as one idea. Sort of stuff Ophelia sings about. It's important that Ophelia goes mad, quote unquote, after the death of her father. She's got no husband to tell her what to do. She won't get to the nunnery to be controlled by priests of the church. Her father is dead. Her brother is gone. Ophelia is free. There's no man, no representative of the symbolic order to tell her what to do. So she mourns where no one's allowed to mourn. She sings. She acts in ways that everyone around her finds so disturbing and threatening because she's unhinged. She's unfettered by the patriarchal world that seeks to control her by making her something we can easily represent. Gabby said something about this in the focused discussion last week. Let's take a look at that real quick.
The whole uncertainty is what madness is. Madness is just a descent into, uncertainty, not knowing where you're going, not knowing what's happening around you. And it's making you crazy. You don't know what's right. You don't know what's wrong.
See, Ophelia's madness is a descent away from all these forms of power and authority, the rules of the superego. But it's also an ascent into the real by dissenting against the rules of the ruling order. It's a rejection of the order of the world represented by Polonius or Claudius or Hamlet or Claudlet or whoever you want. The only way to stop her now is to kill her. This is a tragedy, after all. It's not marked by reconciliation with the real, but with the failure of reconciliation. On this reading, the tragedy isn't the death of Hamlet or Claudius or Laertes or Gertrude. The tragedy is the death of Ophelia, who got free and then was drowned, pulled into the mud by her dress, her gendered clothing. We had a glimpse of the world beyond patriarchy, and then patriarchy kills it. It's tragic in a very real sense. So, the ambiguity of female agency in this play actually underscores the same sense of waste and loss that all other elements of the play tend toward. But if we buckle down on one side or the other of this ambiguity, then the whole message is lost. It's important to let the ambiguity play out. When you find the conflicting moments, you don't have to choose a side. Instead, dwell, focus on those moments, and see where they lead you. Another one of these key ambiguities is the ghost himself. As we'd said before, Hamlet is the only character to hear the ghost. He may be a figment of imagination or even lying. Or, on the other hand, he could be telling the truth. There's really no way of knowing. I'd like to return to the ending from the lecture last week. Remember, I said waste, rupture, contradiction, catharsis. There are a lot of ways this plays out in Hamlet. But here's my thesis. Hamlet is ultimately about coming to terms with grief. Not individual grief only, as maybe the grief of a father losing his son, but a collective grief of a culture as a whole that has failed to reconcile its multiple contradictions and is about to face a reckoning. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark, and by St. Patrick, it's about to rise with a vengeance. Now, I stand by that. There's something inescapable about the role of grief in this play. In a very real way, the tragedy of Ophelia is also rooted in grief. Grief over the character and the loss of her family, but also the collective grief of the audience over the loss of her potential to exist beyond patriarchy. There's another level of collective grief in here, but it requires a bit more historical background. I'm indebted to Stephen Greenblatt here, the editor of our textbook, maybe the most prominent living Shakespeare scholar working today. This is from his book, Hamlet in Purgatory. A bit like Showalter, he starts by working against the critical impulse to read into the text and miss the actual things that the text does and says. Specifically, the kinds of psychoanalytic readings of the ghost that read it as a symbol of repression or some other such nonsense. Greenblatt writes, the overwhelming emphasis on the psychological dimension, crowned by the psychoanalytic readings of the play in the 20th century, has the odd effect of eliminating the ghost as ghost, turning it into the prince's traumatic memory, or alternatively, into a conventional piece of dispensable stage machinery. But if we do not let the ghost vanish altogether, we can perhaps begin to recognize that the psychological in Shakespeare's tragedy is constructed almost entirely out of the theological, and specifically out of the issue of remembrance that lay at the heart of crucial early 16th century debate about purgatory. That's a very specific claim. The key to getting what Hamlet is really about lies in better understanding obscure debates about 16th century theology. But I'll argue, following Greenblatt, that once we get this historical background in place, we'll actually be able to make a much more precise claim about repression, one that applies not only to the end of the Elizabethan era in Shakespeare's own time, but to our own moment as well. Greenblatt points to debates about purgatory specifically here. This is a less important debate now, even for Catholics, but it was really important at the time, given that the rapid shift between Protestantism and Catholicism at the highest levels of state power. We talked about this a bit in the past. Henry VIII breaks from Rome. His son Edward makes the break with the Pope even more dramatic. Mary, Edward's sister, makes the country Catholic again and spends most of her free time chasing down and executing Protestant heretics. Elizabeth, the last daughter of Henry and the final step in Tudor succession, makes the country Protestant again, outlawing some key Catholic beliefs, one of them being purgatory in 1563. Now, purgatory is the belief in an intermediate stage of the afterlife, not quite heaven, not quite hell. It was a place for people who had been baptized in the Catholic Church and therefore redeemed by God, but had died without having full confession of their sins, and so therefore still under their effects. A soul in this condition cannot go be with God, since God is perfect and cannot abide sin, but cannot go to hell either because they had already been redeemed. Purgatory then was the place where such sin could be paid for, or better yet, purged, as the name implies. Now, it's pretty clear that old Hamlet is not in heaven. He mentions burning fires and curses and sin and stuff, but it also doesn't seem like he's in hell. It's an important element of Anglican Protestant doctrine that after death comes judgment. Dead Hamlet's soul needs to be either in heaven or in hell. But if that's the case, then by all rights, he shouldn't be wandering around Denmark in the dead of night anyways. There's no room for ghosts in this binary. There's also a ton of literary clues that connect Hamlet's ghost to purgatory. He tells his son, I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, and for the day confined to fast and fires, till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away. It seems pretty clear from that old Hamlet's punishment is not eternal, but, quote, for a certain term. And the fires aren't seen as punishment so much as purification from sins, his foul crimes. Young Hamlet seems to pick up the thread. His responses to Horatio and company after seeing the ghost are layered with phrases used in Catholic rites. He even invokes St. Patrick in response to Horatio. Yes, by St. Patrick. There is Horatio, and much offense too, he says. That may seem like an odd name to drop in here. What's this got to do with getting pinched or wearing green or leprechauns or snake charming? St. Patrick, according to Catholic tradition, was well known to be the patron saint of souls in purgatory. If you wanted to get a buddy out of purging fires, or at least shorten his time there, the saint you invoked was St. Patrick. Praying for a loved one that died in full blossom of their sin, as Hamlet's father had, could help alleviate suffering, not impute righteousness or hasten forgiveness, but give endurance. Modern readers could very easily gloss this quick reference, but Shakespeare's audience would have made the connection right away. This is a Catholic ghost in a Protestant world. That's really important when we consider the context again. Now, while kings and queens are playing theological ping pong between Protestantism and Catholicism, your average John Bull might not be so easily swayed. Now, for some people, the culturally or nominally Christian sure arose by any other name, but those deeply religious folks on either side of this coin are having to navigate some serious upheaval. On the one hand, the growing Protestant minority finally have a voice and are immediately escorted into positions of power. On the other hand, those who once held power are now disenfranchised and marginalized. As is often the case, new people in power continue to act defensively, but with the full apparatus of the state on their side, that quickly turns into oppression of the new minority. By the time Shakespeare's writing Hamlet, the power dynamics were settled. Protestants were in full control. Catholic beliefs weren't just frowned upon, they were outlawed. This will all come to a head a few years after this play was first performed in 1601. In 1605, a group of Catholics underwent a plot to overthrow the new Protestant King James by blowing up the House of Lords. They filled the basement with 36 barrels of gunpowder. Just before it could be lit, the plot was discovered, and the man guarding the gunpowder, a guy named Guy Fawkes, was arrested, then tortured, then executed. Now, don't mishear me. Disliking the outcomes of a change in political representation is not a valid reason for violent insurrection. I'm making the opposite point. If you oppress a group of people long enough, if you take away their rights, and you cripple their economies and neighborhoods, you police their bodies, if you work to keep them out of the system and on the margins, the anger will simmer. It will rise to a boil. It's bound to explode. But it's really important to acknowledge that the ghost does more than calling Hamlet to avenge his death. He ends by saying, "Remember me. Remember me." For a soul in purgatory, that remembrance means a lessening of suffering through prayers. But for the hundreds of thousands of Catholic souls in 16th century England, it might mean something different. For them, maybe it's remember us, give us justice, don't cut us out. For the marginalized groups right now that are fighting for a voice and recognition, it might mean something else too. Remember us, get revenge on the system that has oppressed us. Remember us, remember. Look, I'm going to end with this. There's a reason we're still reading this play 400 years later. It's not just because of some vague feelings it gives about waste or sadness. It's not just because it's so complex or even so influential. It's not just because we're looking to purge our own guilty consciences of cultural harm or collective trauma. The two things we find displayed in full ambiguity, things that systems of knowing have a hard time reconciling, the agency of women and the rights of the oppressed, are still things we find ourselves fighting for. As I record this, we're still trying to make sense of the violence in Atlanta last week. Women, marginalized for their race and for their work, murdered. Remember them. Look, there's a way the catharsis of the tragedy can short-circuit real reconciliation. It could bring up our repressed fears and kill them without us even knowing it. But that will mean that the power that repressed them in the first place, the superego, the patriarchy, whatever, gets a pass. But the tragedy can do more than that. It can make us remember. It can make us call to mind again to acknowledge, if only for a moment, the things we've been forced to ignore. Remember, if only for a moment. Like the image of a ghost fading away at dawn, or the echoes from a song from a riverbank. Remember, carry their bodies to the stage. Remember, bear witness of the things we've seen. Remember, there's a simmering anger set to explode. Remember, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophies.